No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin. Hi. And welcome to your favorite channel where you can know all about great books in a blink. If you like this content, remember to like and share it with all your friends and family and everyone who's interested in knowing all about great books. Overview. No Ordinary Time by Doris Kearns Goodwin is a unique blend of history and biography, exploring the leadership and personal relationships of President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, and his wife, Eleanor. The book also explores how they, and their inner circle, managed crisis after crisis, from the Nazi invasion of Western Europe in May 1940 through FDR's death in April 1945. Their unique husband and wife, President and First Lady, partnership was the driving force not only behind U.S. and Allied success, but also in improving U.S. society at home despite the challenges of war. In May of 1940, Hitler launched an attack on Western Europe. At the time, the Roosevelts were busy with the work of pulling a struggling nation forward out of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in the history of the U.S. and the world. The Roosevelt administration made history and redefined the relationship between the government and the people in the U.S. First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt redefined the role of First Lady as an active political force, never before or after equaled in terms of power and influence for First Ladies. FDR engaged the average voter in ways not seen since the days of Andrew Jackson. At a time when a severe economic crisis could have easily produced anarchy and revolution in the U.S., FDR saved free market capitalism from itself by introducing reforms and pensions designed to protect the weak, the poor, and the elderly from destitution and exploitation at the hands of powerful corporations. A minimum wage, a maximum hourly work week, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, and Social Security were products of FDR's New Deal series of domestic programs enacted from 1933 to 1936. None of these gains were guaranteed. In 1940, FDR's second term was almost over, with no president ever running for a third term since George Washington declined to do so in 1797. Murmurs of tyranny and dictatorship filled the air at the prospect of an unprecedented third FDR term, and if he lost, or did not run, or if the Republicans, who hated the New Deal, took the White House, people worried about what would happen to the progress made for average citizens, such as Social Security and minimum wage. With the eruption of a global war and Western Europe's fall to Nazi tyranny, there were concerns that the United States would no longer be a free, independent country or a democracy. Through it all, Eleanor was a tireless and effective advocate for the poorest, neediest, and most vulnerable citizens, often acting as her polio-stricken husband's eyes and ears on the U.S. and its people. She often influenced and swayed FDR when it came to important political and policy decisions. FDR was raised by his imposing, strict, but doting, mother to be very precocious at an early age, to always present a cheerful and proud outward appearance, and to never show vulnerability or intense emotion. Eleanor was starved for affection as a child, receiving it only from her rarely present alcoholic father who died young. She found inspiration in intellectual and activist pursuits, befriending a number of remarkable women who helped develop her grand talents for organization and advocacy that set the fire of reform in her heart. FDR and Eleanor developed mutual admiration for each other's intellect, passion, and political interests. Still, overshadowed by FDR's mother, and insecure as a parent, Eleanor never felt comfortable in the role of mother to her own 6 children. She also found it difficult to connect with FDR both because she had never been comfortable with sexuality and because he was a person who kept his inner emotions and deepest thoughts to himself. Just like his mother was with him, he was not very direct in bestowing the affection Eleanor craved. Her more cerebral focus to the exclusion of all else clashed with FDR's love of fun, drink, and party atmospheres. Eleanor's special and unique role in U.S. history was partly the byproduct of an affair FDR had with another woman. Lucy Mercer was hired to be Eleanor's social secretary in 1914. An affair began between Lucy and FDR in 1916 that continued as FDR became Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I. Lucy provided all the things for FDR that Eleanor could not. Eleanor discovered the affair after seeing Lucy's letters to FDR among his belongings when he returned from Europe in 1918. After a difficult period, their relationship was redefined. They were still companions, supporting each other's professional and political pursuits, and Eleanor was granted an unprecedented level of independence and autonomy. However, they would never again share the intimate type of relationship typical of a husband and wife. This relationship would evolve into a spectacular partnership, especially when FDR was crippled by polio. He depended on his wife's active role and ability to act independently. Committed to many of the same political ideals and goals, they retained a mutual admiration and affection. They were able to support each other greatly in their careers and pursuits, even through 2 terms in the White House. It continued this way as the world went to war. The Roosevelts would achieve remarkable success. This was due to a combination of FDR's faith in U.S. capability, his deft managing of so many disparate and competing parts of U.S. society, his understanding of and ability to move the U.S. public opinion and to know just the right moment to do so. It also contributed to Eleanor's unwavering commitment to social justice, her ability to find the truth of conditions on the ground, and their ability to shore up each other's weaknesses. At any one moment in 1940 and in 1941, momentous events overseas were threatened with a negative outcome just as much by domestic U.S. crises as they were by German or Japanese troops. Britain would have very likely fallen economically or militarily during this time if FDR had not managed to find very creative ways acceptable to the U.S. public to send Britain arms and supplies. FDR also succeeded in balancing the hostile interests of labor and business. FDR encouraged the government and big business to call a truce and find a way for the government to assume enough risk for business to feel comfortable switching to military production. At vital points in producing crucial supplies for both Britain and Soviet Russia, Eleanor brought to FDR's attention the very real problems facing labor, African American and women workers, strikes, unrest, and production shortfalls that could have been the difference between victory and failure at El Alamein in November of 1942. If FDR had not done what he did, even allowing for some shortcomings in his actions, to mobilize the U.S. for war to the extent he did, the U.S. could have taken far longer to push back against Germany at El Alamein, leading to possible failure. Victory, however, convinced the people that the U.S. was a liberating force, increasing support for the U.S.'s role in the war. Furthermore, without the unique partnerships among government and individual titans of business brought about specifically by FDR and Eleanor's efforts, the U.S. would not have set the stage in 1940 to 1941 for the massive successes of 1942 to 1944 in production that surpassed any and all expectations, including the president's own lofty goals. It was this amazing production capability, more than U.S. manpower, that won the war and kept both Britain and the Soviet Union from succumbing to the Third Reich when each nation was in its darkest hour. It also gave the U.S. enough time to train and arm its own military to prepare for combat. Even as the efforts and stakes increased overseas, the challenges at home did, too. Multiple issues confronted the Roosevelts at a time when they were under intense physical and emotional challenges. There was more activism and demands from African Americans asking for the right to serve in the military in combat roles, to be free of segregationist policies, and to be treated better by government-contracted war industry employers. There were problems with women, who were needed in the workforce, in procuring adequate childcare as well as more fights between labor and industry. In 1944, there was a tough re-election campaign that called into question FDR's health and included a battle over who would be vice president. Finally, there was a battle over a new United Nations organization and the struggle of balancing the competing interests of Stalin and Churchill. Yet, up until FDR's death in 1945, Eleanor and FDR Roosevelt joined together to accomplish virtual miracles in transforming the face of the U.S. and the world for the better despite some serious political and personal disagreements and the fact that each left the other feeling unfulfilled as a husband and a wife. Between the two of them, they not only did much to save the world from fascist tyranny, but also made sure the U.S. did so in a way that did not require a sacrifice of its democratic soul. They made sure that the democracy the U.S. kept at home was worth fighting for and even better than before the war. Character analysis. While FDR and Eleanor shared deeply held political convictions and ideologies, their personalities, apart from their vibrant intellect, were practically opposites. Always the life of the party and the center of attention, FDR delighted in being around crowds of people as well as in gossip, small talk, cocktail hours, and playfulness. Eleanor, on the other hand, lacked a capacity for, or the ability to, enjoy all of these. Yet she would become extremely close emotionally to a select few people and bare her soul to them, holding nothing back and showering them with tender words, affection, and steadfast emotional support and sympathy. This was in sharp contrast to FDR, who, ever since his childhood under the guidance of his very reserved mother, would keep his true emotions and feelings, his insecurities and vulnerabilities, hidden from those closest to him. His extreme effort to shield the U.S. public from his disability right up until his post-Yalta speech before a joint session of Congress in March 1945, less than 6 weeks before his death, spoke enormously to this aspect of his personality. FDR was like a celestial object around which everyone would find in orbit. Those closest to FDR who sought a deeper intimacy and a letting down of the guard would be consistently disappointed, with the largely speculative exception of Lucy Mercer. Nobody exemplified this more than Missy LeHand, whose love of and obsession for FDR was so deep that her mental and physical well-being depended on his sunshine, his attention and affection, and broke down when those rays disappeared. Those who did best around FDR were those who also enjoyed his company but did not depend on him for emotional sustainability. Harry Hopkins, though at times hurt by the growing distance between himself and FDR near the end of both of their lives, found solace and love in his last wife, Louise. In fact, in a rare instance of the tables being turned, FDR himself felt slighted when Hopkins moved out of the White House to create a separate home with his new wife. For her part, Eleanor was severely hurt by FDR several times and suffered from a general and deep sense of loneliness, but also found a select few number of confidants, including a possibly romantic affair with a famous female reporter, an intimate friendship with a young activist named Joe Lash, a rekindled bond with her daughter, Anna, in whom she found fulfillment where FDR fell short. FDR spent much of his leisure time with more carefree women, possibly engaging in several affairs, including 2 of his cousins and a Swedish princess, to make up for Eleanor's deficiencies. Eleanor mostly, though not always, tolerated these affairs, with the major exception being Lucy Mercer, aware of her own shortcomings, just as FDR tolerated Eleanor's devotion to her causes over devotion to him, even when, not long before he died, FDR tried a few times to rekindle a more intimate relationship with Eleanor but was rejected. Eleanor chose to give precedence to her work. A major test for Anna Roosevelt came when, after years of being close with her mother and sympathizing with her over her father's affair with Lucy, FDR asked Anna to assume the lead role in social duties at the White House, a role that clashed with her mother's role. In the process, Anna came to better understand her father and became a companion that knew both how to give FDR what he needed and understood when guests were pushing FDR too hard. It would, ironically, be against her own mother's incessant pressing of her father that Anna would find her most difficult protective duty. When others would see that FDR, sick and tired, needed to be left alone, Eleanor would simply keep pressing her case over and over again, never losing sight of those for whom she bravely and selflessly fought. Simultaneously, Eleanor was unable to see when she pressed FDR too far. Far more aware of her father's illness than almost anyone else, Anna helped her father reconnect with Lucy Mercer despite her awareness that he had promised Eleanor never to see her again. Anna had been angry at her father for the affair he had with Lucy, but, seeing an old, possibly dying man with the weight of the world on his shoulders, her sympathies grew enough to arrange this reunion with Lucy Mercer. FDR died in Lucy's presence, and while this crushed Eleanor at first, she was eventually able to forgive both FDR and Anna, finally coming to realize how hard she had been on him with her constant lobbying. She also understood that her own shortcomings in not being able to provide him comfort and the knowledge that she had rejected his last attempts to redefine their relationship more intimately pushed him toward Lucy again. Ultimately, both FDR and Eleanor's personalities girded them for their triumphs. For Eleanor, her inability to find emotional fulfillment from those around her made her become ever more focused on her work for social justice. Her hours working and steadfastness exceeded even the president's and his most loyal advisors. Some of her greatest victories in civil rights and for women were nail-biters that would not have happened, and they did if it were not for many a sleep-deprived night. For FDR, his ability to always be cheerful and to project genuine optimism achieved many miracles in motivating his countrymen and allies alike, even as his inability to emotionally open up to people allowed him to focus on his work and not to be dragged down by the tragedies and miseries of those around him. Too much was at stake for FDR to indulge in emotions, and this quality made him a more effective leader even as it hurt those who loved him the most. To a degree, FDR did use people around him and did not fully reciprocate their devotion, but the times he governed and the office he held almost demanded this. Eleanor, while being sensitive to the needs and feelings of her confidants in U.S. society, was generally unable to gauge her husband's needs and often treated him as a means to her political ends. It was these ends and working towards them so well together that made them such a singular and winning, if flawed, team. First theme. Sacrifice. In any examination of World War II, sacrifice is an inevitable theme. In the story of the U.S. during the war, as well as the Roosevelts and their inner circle who led the country to triumph, sacrifice was undoubtedly present. The reader finds quite early in the book a Britain that was stoically suffering from Nazi bombardment, and the Soviets, who were sacrificing along with Britain in standing up to the Nazi war machine. Throughout the entire book, Eleanor sacrificed her personal life for social justice to the point that her quest for social justice almost replaced her personal life. U.S. soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and merchants sacrificed their lives from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Guadalcanal to Midway, from North Africa to Italy, from the Atlantic to the Battle of the Bulge. U.S. workers accepted long, grueling hours and rationing of all kinds of materials, from cars and fuel to coffee and sugar. Businesses sacrificed profit margins, women undertook dramatic new responsibilities, and minorities, like African Americans and Japanese Americans, suffered terrible discrimination at the hands of their countrymen, society, and government, even as they jumped at the chance to fight and die in combat for the U.S. Wendell Willkie, FDR's main Republican political rival, repeatedly sacrificed potential partisan political gain to stand by FDR when he knew FDR to be right, much to the chagrin of some in his party. There were many emotional sacrifices as both people and leaders put the country's interests above their personal desires. These unfulfilled desires are discussed throughout the book. An extremely sick Hopkins kept putting off his own happiness, serving his country constantly, and even delayed moving out of the White House with his new wife to keep serving FDR in a closer capacity, so that even when he did move into his own house, there was precious little time before his body gave out and he died. FDR, for all the times he did see Lucy, likely the love of his life, there were many more times when he stayed totally apart from her, denying himself one of his most intimate connections out of a different kind of love and respect for Eleanor. The four Roosevelt boys all sacrificed and served their country. Anna Roosevelt put her precious relationship with her mother in jeopardy to bring comfort to her ailing father while he led the free world. Missy LeHand, never married and died young, sacrificed herself for FDR and the country. FDR, as well as Harry Hopkins, essentially worked themselves to death in public service. Second theme. Love. At first glance, a reader would not characterize a No Ordinary Time as a love story, and it certainly is not in a traditional sense. However, a broader conception reveals love to be a major theme. In Eleanor, there burned a love for all the humble, oppressed, poor U.S. society members, ready to play their part in society but denied that opportunity through some combination of bad luck, injustice, or oppression. There was something of a love affair between the U.S. and British people, and between FDR and Churchill. Churchill played the suitor, FDR the bride-to-be, and what was perhaps the strongest union between any two people and nation in recorded history took place in an atmosphere of incredible affection despite any differences. There are the loves FDR had for the women who were closest to him, including his mother, his cousins Lucy and Margaret, Missy Luhand, Princess Martha of Sweden, his daughter, Anna, his great romantic love for Lucy Mercer, and the great admiration and respect he had for Eleanor, no less a strong love if, admittedly, of a different nature. This last love created a powerful partnership that enabled both, working together, to serve the country they loved to the best of their ability. At the center of it all was FDR, whom these women all adored in their own way. There is, in this book, the love of country shown by many means, including how so many U.S. citizens answered the call to duty by giving their lives in combat and sacrificing their possessions willingly by generously adding to supplies of war material. There is love of country in the minorities who put up with horrible treatment and still volunteered to serve and fight bravely with distinction. Love of country is also visible when women gave up being homemakers for the brave new world of being factory employees who worked with heavy machinery. There is love of freedom which enabled soldiers to sacrifice their lives so that others may have freedom and the nation may persevere. There is the love of FDR's closest advisors and political partners, perhaps most exemplified, aside from Eleanor, in Hopkins and Churchill, that inspired, aided, and sustained FDR politically even as his female friends sustained him in other ways. Finally, there is the love that both FDR and Eleanor had for U.S. citizens and that U.S. citizens had for them, a love to which FDR and Eleanor gave over 12 years of their lives in service to them as President and First Lady. In the fact that U.S. voters chose the Roosevelts for an unprecedented 4 terms, answered and exceeded each and every call to action that rang from the Roosevelts' voices. Third theme. Justice. Justice is a key theme of the book. On the grassroots level, there were the efforts of women to earn respect in the war industry workplace that were eventually so successful that managers found women to be better workers in significant ways. There was, too, the struggle to give all workers the ability to unionize within large companies like Ford. Then there was the especially challenging effort of black people to earn the right to serve in their country's armed forces in all capacities. They wanted to serve as pilots and as members of combat troops, not just as servants and drivers. There was a challenge to overcome a humiliating, discriminatory, and segregated system. On the home front, black U.S. citizens fought to find employment in the war industry, aside from the most dangerous and lowest skilled jobs, and to be part of unions. In each of these situations, Eleanor was a tireless, fearless, and constant advocate for the people and their causes. She was constantly looking at citizens' conditions all over the country up close and in person, whether they were in the Deep South, Detroit, or Maine. Her daily columns were filled with calls for justice. She constantly held meetings with activists, and did everything she could to engage the proper officials. She set up meetings for activists with her husband, and encouraged her husband to push relevant officials into action, or to take what action he could himself. This was all despite opposition from the public and senior administration officials, including Secretary of War Stimson, Secretary of War Knox, as well as some of her husband's close advisors. FDR was a committed, if cautious, partner on the issues of civil and gender rights. He usually sided with his wife on these issues even if change was incremental and slow due to the need to balance numerous interests, a need to consider the advice of senior advisors, who warned of unrest, division, and performance problems that rarely existed or were overcome, and dealing with a public that was still racist and sexist. Without her husband's authority or his agreement with her on these issues, little, if anything, would have come from Eleanor's efforts. Yet working together, and with Eleanor able to give FDR political cover with white Southern Democrats, they accomplished a great deal. This earned the loyalty of African Americans to the degree that 71% of African American voters cast their vote for FDR in the 1936 presidential election. Prior to that, most African American voters had cast their vote for a Republican. Eleanor also focused on the struggles to prevent and end the internment of Japanese Americans and Japanese immigrants, as well as the rights of Jews in Europe and to allow Jews to immigrate safely to the U.S. However, between the intransigence and anti-Semitism of major officials in the State and War Departments, the racism and anti-Semitism of U.S. citizens, and FDR's beliefs that the best way to save the Jews was to quickly win the war, and his warnings of his advisors of the security threat and overreaction of West Coast citizens should the Japanese not be interned, justice failed both the Japanese and the Jews. These failures would be among the greatest of the Roosevelt administration. Fourth theme: compromise and timing. A key element of the success of the Roosevelt administration was FDR's sense of timing and his ability to compromise. These were not traits that his wife possessed, and without his possession of them there would have been little likelihood of success for any of their programs or ideas. The fact of the matter is that the time period in which this book begins, isolationism was the overwhelming sentiment of the U.S. citizens. When Churchill was begging for U.S. aid, as much as FDR wanted to help Britain, he knew full well he had to bring the U.S. citizens along and find legal ways to do so when laws enforcing neutrality were on the books. With few exceptions, all throughout the period in question FDR was able to gauge where the U.S. citizens were on a particular issue, figure out how and when he could move their opinion close enough to his to take a step or steps without driving the people away from his aims and himself out of office, execute this plan, and repeat it over and over again. Some ways in which he did this was by engaging business leaders and unions to adopt a war footing, getting U.S. citizens to want to support Britain, or getting the public to accept a draft of rationing. Perhaps alone among world leaders, FDR knew when it was wise to help his allies before his own country, thereby allowing Britain and Russia to buy the U.S. precious time to prepare for war, or forcing the issue of war upon the U.S. before it was ready. Only by compromising between the great forces of the U.S., which include labor, business, minorities, women, political parties as well as the various allied powers, was he able to get the U.S. on a proper war footing, win a war, and plan for the post-war world in a powerful and lasting way. For FDR, much of his true political genius lay in this sense of timing and an ability to compromise to get results. Fifth and last theme: hope. The theme of hope shines throughout this book. Against a backdrop of economic calamity and the fear of fascist militaristic aggressors, the U.S. rose to the challenges of building an arsenal of democracy and of fighting a war all over the globe on multiple continents and oceans at the same time. Even when there were individual, sometimes heated, disagreements, FDR's senior advisors generally maintained hope in him and his leadership. FDR helped to instill hope in all around him, his advisors, the mass of U.S. citizens, and his overseas allies with his face-to-face meetings, his speeches, and his fireside chats. He set spectacular goals that few initially believed in but that people imbued with FDR's hope were able to accomplish, helping the U.S. citizens to place hope in their own abilities and in final victory. The people placed their hope in him, to the tune of electing him an unprecedented 4 times, and he, in turn, always placed, and never gave up hope, in them. His constant smile, good humor, and general optimism was infectious not just in the White House but all across the U.S. Without a doubt, this hope was a key ingredient in the U.S.'s victories in World War II and in forging a new world order centered around the United Nations and the great powers avoiding direct war with each other. It is almost unthinkable to imagine a positive result, for all its problems, without this hope instilled into the people by the Roosevelts. Lastly, no matter their difficulties and disagreements, Eleanor and FDR never gave up hope in each other's political talents and leadership, or in the value of each other's perspective. This quality enabled them to become what must still be termed the most dynamic and powerful President-First Lady partnership in U.S. history. Today, not only the U.S. but also the world are benefiting from the effects of this remarkable partnership of 2 remarkable individuals. We hope you enjoyed the insights on Doris Kearns Goodwin's No Ordinary Time. You can purchase the book to learn more. Thank you for watching, and hope to see you soon.